Video 43, are we heading into the end of the multipolar phase? The four agendas which were mentioned in the last video seem to be turning on themselves, as the end of the multipolar phase appears to be caused by the inevitable dynamic within societies in general evolving. So what I mean by this is that as these wars go on, they are starting to raise increasing amounts of questions about themselves. So as it started with the idea of religious and political freedom for all factions within themselves, the multipolar phase, it represented a move forward from the overall pattern in history which led to the problem of terrorism and broke it up. So in other words, we can realize that we had the problem of terrorism as the problem with the structure of the postmodern age. And what governments have done is use the relativity that's come through the need for the postmodern age to break down the meta-narratives of the European empires to create a period when the issue of that relativity is kind of moving forward towards a new type of objectivity. So in other words, the multipolar phase enabled the situation to move forward, but the greater than almost total sense of relativity within officialdom enabled the situation to create freedom of competition within every country really, and in terms of the factions within them then competing to be the dominant paradigm. And the way things have moved forward has been kind of like organized chaos rather than being a consensus over the way things should move forward in a total, or we may previously called a classical sense. So henceforth it has led to the way that progress is occurring being somewhat out of control within the context of those four agendas whose paths are crossing over the center ground: Israel, Iran, Russia, and the US. And you can see how this occurred from previous videos. It's just that now the multipolar phase in itself is running out of time to create the next period. So as we can cross this idea with the concept that the Holocene is becoming the Anthropocene, then we do actually have a framework that we can use to kind of put that kind of map on and see it like a set of coordinates in terms of where we are overall, and we can plot the course of this little phase that we're in now, kind of moving forward in the context of the bigger periods. And it's just that now the multipolar phase itself is running out of time, so we can see that new measures need to be brought in. And this is, I think, why the world is continuing to tolerate these wars over the center ground now, that's essentially on the border between the East and the West again. So we've got Israel in the Middle East, Russia in Ukraine. The issue here is clearly about East and West, and it's clearly about the kind of NATO versus BRICS relationship that's come out of the Cold War. So I guess governments have to be talking about it, and the UN has to be talking about what governments are talking about. So it seems like that the sense of relativity that we've got at the moment has just left enough structure to make a new phase out of, while having tolerated the problem of these wars in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, US, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, and also in Africa. So is it time now for people to realize why these wars do not make sense from a future point of view? So we must be thinking, how do we get through this phase? How have these been the result of this phase? And they're not entirely the result of this phase, they're the result of the way the world's come into and through this phase, aren't they? So the overall dynamic of the Anthropocene is starting to take precedence over the Holocene. So the people with the education are managing the situation in terms of this big framework, and people at large are just getting caught up in this situation. So of course people realizing would be a solution, because then they wouldn't want to do that anymore. They'd want to talk about what was happening and discuss a solution instead. And people must see that there has to be a way out and hence the new problem is essentially the new imperative found in this new direction. So it's not a single direction, but instead it's kind of 200 countries with different directions. So really what could happen, first of all, is a consensus really over the fact that this is the new phase that we're entering. So, in terms of overall phases, to look at what's been happening. So right now we have millions of people whose lives have been caught up in the problem of these wars, but the world cannot have another phase which is the same as the last. So on the one hand, it's got to be different and an improved situation. On the other hand, it has to be a continuation of the way that the world's evolved already. So perhaps we could say this was the world avoiding World War III, and maybe it'll happen anyway, but at least now we've made sure we can control the way that it does happen, if it's going to happen. And I think this is why people are somewhat reluctant to put their faith in governments, because governments can easily choose. It seems like they can just choose good or evil at the moment, and that's perfectly acceptable because of how the world is, and because it's fragmented and everything's relative. Then they have the power really to abuse, and that's what people seem to be realizing now, is that governments do regularly abuse their power in massive ways, and nobody can do anything about it because of the way that the whole system works. So while people have suggested that it was Guterres and the UN slow response to a changing world order, which has caused the Middle East to spill over into the conflicts that we have now, and also including the NATO BRICS kind of confrontation in Ukraine. But what did they really expect to happen if this issue is not being discussed? And it seems like just NATO expansion forever because of the war on terror is just simply not possible. So because we can see this the way this dynamic necessarily had to unfold, mainly because of the way the situation has been managed, then that is because of the pattern which has emerged out of world history. So governments can kind of denounce the situation and at the same time kind of deny responsibility for the way that things have happened, because they've just had to inherit the situation and the system from the last guy that held their office. So that's why things don't fundamentally change, and people advance, but they don't fundamentally start to do things in a different way. So this is where we have to get the incentive from to enter a new phase, as the alternative appears to be the full-blown World War III, given the dynamics that we've got now. So it seems like governments need the power to control the situation, to implement the measures which lead into the new phase, because people get more reluctant as time goes by to actually trust governments with the authority to tell them what to do. So governments now seem to have this kind of absolute power to manage situations now with computers, with AI, and it seems like that they're having quite an easy time really pushing everyone around. And this is really only limited by the situation that we're in. Or is it more like this is the end of what real authoritarianism looks like, as we are finally addressing the problems of the pattern which arose out of history in a whole and discussing the world order? It's just the trouble is that this is only happening at the very highest levels, and people at large with no education or do not even maybe have the ability to read really cannot get a grip on these ideas at all. And so I'd like to help in that sense. So it's more kind of from the sublime UN perspective, really, if we compare this to national government and nationalism and kind of angry sort of nationalists who want their country back and they want it to be a better place and all that. And then we've got, say, like the very kind of abstract thinkers at the UN considering how the world actually needs to get into the next phase. Then you can see the difference between the kind of levels of government and society that we've got. So it's no wonder that everyone wants to be up with the billionaires in the UN kind of category, rather than being in the fighting for survival in the nationalist category. But it does go to show maybe as well why people in nationalism value the other nationalists maybe more than other people normally value each other. So, given that the structure of the age is moving forward, and most people are caught up in all this from their own national kind of subjective points of view, through which they try to reason with the way that events occurred, but never really kind of find an entirely kind of satisfying explanation for how the world works, and have to settle with the idea that they only have to, people need to just serve their own country and fight for their own country against each other and other countries. I don't know if they've ever thought really maybe that's why there's so many problems going on an international level, but maybe they just don't even think that. So it's just that this is the situation that the UN has to look at and try and find solutions in terms of the way that it's moving the situation forward. And if every country's fighting each other, then there's not really much to create progress out of. So on the other hand, the socialists, they try to take over everyone and everything that they come into contact with and involve them in their idea of what a solution is. So no wonder the nationalists have to fighting back against that kind of principle, because out of necessity, timescales, distances between events, and the relationships between perspectives are being measured and judged right now by people with the ability to do something about them. So what sort of world should we be talking about heading into? In terms of what's being discussed in terms of government, we can see the overall dynamics, but then there is the way that directives come down the chains of command through the protocols which have already been established through previous phases. And this is a problem for everybody, because it means that we can't reason with the people above us, and it means that directives are designed in a way so that they come flying down the chain with no disagreement, because if there is a disagreement, then it leads to a tribunal, or it leads to a disciplinary procedure, or it leads to a kind of refusal to comply and a kind of court-martial, or whatever the government wants to say is the penalty for not complying with everything that they say. So given the issue of the shape of the world order, it's generally accepted that this is a difficult issue, and so the idea that certain countries are at war with each other is not so unreasonable as something that we can appreciate, is it? So people have been questioning for a while, really, why can we have something that's perfectly legal in one place, despite perfectly rational arguments, has been completely displaced by the way that events need to take a certain form in another place? And why do we have this prejudice and intolerance in one place towards one thing, and then another form just in the other place, while absolutely illegal things are looked upon as normal? So hopefully people will see the absurdity in this through the way that I think the way the world will change in general as those four agendas play out, and the issues of grand strategies, attack vectors, and pawns are going to become something that people look at as being kind of something that's very primitive, really, that obviously leads to war. And if people are doing that and behaving that in that way, and they're not getting along in terms of doing good business, then they should be replaced by somebody who's got a more progressive attitude. And every country is required by new rules at each stage, really, which emerge to rationalize directives when it comes to the overall global development strategy. I can see it's not just the case that Russia and the US know what is happening. It's more like an educated level which runs through governments, influencing the way that their departments implement policies. It is tempting to think things like, well, okay, so what's France doing? Where are the influential countries that could be standing up for themselves? France is where the revolution started, so maybe France is just thinking that this is the problem with the revolution, and the world needs to really find out why it happened. It just kind of becomes a thing in itself, which nobody has control over. then, as France has been working on maintaining continuity like China, and the UK has previously been involved in the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan, but has now pulled out to concentrate on its own sovereignty. So Germany is usually always too preoccupied with its own kind of its own collective sort of consciousness, really, which spent 900 years as the Holy Roman Empire, while the EU has restructured the situation around it. And we can see the problem of the direction of the mainstream being so set in its ways here, from the fact that its main opposition party is called Alternative for Germany. So I'm not expecting anything from South America either, because their countries there are still facing problems brought about by independence from Spain in previous centuries, like Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia. They all rejected the Spanish Empire when Spain was ruled over by Napoleon. So Iran and the other revolutionary countries, which are traditionally allied with Russia, cannot act against Russia or accuse it of being involved on a higher causal level because of the UN Security Council. So they need to be complicit in whatever the global situation doing at the moment, because of their future depends on it. They need to prepare for the next move by the US or NATO or capitalism or whatever you want to call it. And I think this is why the US has moved quickly to take over the Venezuelan president Maduro, and not in the sense that it doesn't want people to wake up to the way that events are happening, but because of the world's current inability to address the issue. And now Guterres says that these wars are in danger of going out of control. Well, he should know, because they got his fingerprints all over them. So what's happening in this sense? The first thing he's doing is letting the Israel-Gaza conflict blow right up, so as to turn the world's populations against war and make war look totally acceptable. So the US-Iran situation has calmed down and at least pulled away from full-blown conflict. And that seems to be the point we're at, as the world pulls away from the brink of World War III, and the new working relationship involving China, Russia, and the US is then going to help to stabilize global relations. So it's impossible, I think, at this stage to think that the UN does not know what is happening, when they are the ones that are actually designing the steps that governments are going to use to move forward into the next phase. I don't really understand how, I mean, say like you play chess for a while, you're going to look about 3 moves ahead, aren't you? It's just kind of just normal, isn't it? I mean, if you play football, you don't just look at where the ball is, you look at how all the players on the pitch are moving. I find it hard to believe the UN doesn't know what's happening, but I think maybe this is part of the problem that we have now at this stage, is that the government's been acting as a very serious organisation which has kept the peace during the Cold War, and they have been allowed to have this sort of secret kind of way of operating. But I think maybe people in the UN now don't want to do that anymore, or perhaps, you know, the people in the superpowers, they're seeing the future in a world system where countries actually cooperate with each other and not ones which are just simply divided by geopolitics. So the people who've been in wars as well, whose families have been in wars, they don't want to carry on with this if there's a better way of doing things. But it seems now that like the problem is actually making this shift. So I think people are sick of it now, because, well, at least enough to start asking questions about the UN, because if we got to this point where the world's so secure and yet we can just allow these wars to happen at the same time, then questions need to go up the chain to ask what's been happening and to ask who's even in charge. So right now, after US airstrikes killed Ayatollah Khamenei, his family are in charge of Iran, and they've hit nearby countries with rockets in retaliation, while even all-out war will not resolve the issue. So my prediction is a major change, as the UN is vulnerable now to reformists who are asking questions about the way this has all been allowed to happen, when clearly there is no need now, and that needs to be the big move forward. So then people will have existing protocols and structures to contend with. So it may seem a lot of people that while the world has all the resources it needs to solve its problems, the people with power would rather do this instead of actually solve it. But I'm more concerned with the actual future, which will most probably occur, which was as people take this view to their rather naive kind of amateur lobbying platforms at the protest organisation, which they've joined, and many of it are making a tidy profit from the chaos, while the professional lobbyists employed by big oil companies, billionaires, and pharmaceutical companies target individual government officials with cash, holidays, free drugs, dinners, blackmail, and future job offers. So governments tend to treat mass petitions and protests a bit like a block vote. In other words, single issues which can be dismissed easily and don't bother them while they're in their own office or at lunch or during their leisure time, which targeted approaches can, because they can offer political parties donations which enable them to book appointments. And this in itself is enough to prevent fundamental change from happening to societies by ensuring that progress occurs in a particular way in which governments can offer their population a world which is just slightly better than yesterday. So people advance, they don't change, it's just more of the same again and again and again. And it's the same problem that Plato had in the ancient world, and this is what's bothering me. It's the same problem that the ancient Greek philosophers had, and we can't be having that 2,000 years later, because we're still asking questions why people are starving, dying, being enslaved, murdering, torturing in the fight for resources, land, religion, and ideology. Why are they doing it now? And then we have the issue of the Anthropocene outstanding. The AWG, the Anthropocene Working Group, part of the International Union of Geological Sciences, has already failed once to prove the case for the Anthropocene. I even wrote them explaining how the boundaries between the historical periods need to function so that we can understand the proportions in which each period of human civilization evolves into the next. No reply. Even though I'd already spoken to Simon Turner at that email address, I put it clearly in the article that I put out on medium.com in August 2024 on why the boundary between the Holocene and the Anthropocene cannot be in the mid-20th century. Now they've been effectively relocated in China, as the IUGS, or International Union of Geological Sciences, have moved their headquarters to Beijing, meaning that they're under a high level of government supervision. So I don't see them getting it wrong again, but what I do see is the amount of time that's being wasted by bureaucracy and the fact that these are career scientists who want to take the credit when we already have the answers that people need. So I'm assuming that nobody else is allowed to prove the case for the Anthropocene due to treaties between superpowers. And this is where the issue of the balance of the power from the Cold War has gone. So we cannot have progress due to the way that progress is created. It's worth thinking about. So while the world's scientists proceed to milk another 100 million or even 100 billion out of public funds to explore the limited number of hypotheses which seem to be allowed in science by governments at any one time, we must watch these wars being live streamed on social media. And I can understand, though, why a scientist locked in an office with high security and paid highly by governments would not be too bothered about what's happening in the outside world. All the more reason, in fact, to keep up the heroic effort. But now the world is expected to actually function with such a meagre amount of information as career scientists are allowing it to have. I suppose there would be no money in it if they gave it out for free. So I try to balance my efforts between this YouTube channel and articles which are available for free and books with more technical knowledge on the way the world's evolved out of history, which are all now on Amazon after I split with Dynasty Press, and I can see the way change occurs over time as one paradigm replaces another. And this must happen in a civilized way. So perhaps it is just the amount of paradigms which are in circulation right now in real terms compared with the amount of hypotheses which are kind of allowed to exist or being considered by official science. And perhaps what good will come out of this is the end of the multipolar phase will give way to a broader recognition of paradigms by governments, and combined with AI, this will give them the ability to process more information, creating a new political norm whereby it's socially acceptable for people to be able to think globally. For more updates, please subscribe to this channel.